Hello everyone and good evening. My name is Don Arleth and it's time for World Talks here on TVP World, so let's get started. Ukraine is deepening its defense ties with France amid mounting pressure from Russia and internal challenges due to the Energoatom corruption scandal. Today, Presidents Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelenskyy signed a landmark accord outlining plans for Kyiv to acquire Rafale fighter jets and advanced air defense systems. Meanwhile, Finnish President Aleksander Cwalina traveled to NATO headquarters, where he held a press conference with Secretary General Mark Rutte. Cwalina also spoke with Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever to press for a solution to fund Ukraine using frozen Russian assets. And now joining me to discuss these developments and more is Aleksander Cwalina, contractor at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thanks so much for joining us on World Talks.
Hello, good evening. Glad to join.
Yes, now let's start off with what President Zelenskyy achieved by going to Paris today. Let's listen to what Zelenskyy said at a presser.
And the first thing is that Ukraine will be able to receive 100 Rafale F-4 aircraft, very powerful French radars, 8 air defense systems, SAMPs T-6 launchers each. Well, these are details, probably too technical for some, but to us they are important. Each launcher, all these systems will protect lives in Ukraine, and this is very important.
So, Alexander, how significant is this deal? What will it provide Ukraine right now, and what's still down the road?
So the partnership, as you mentioned, is fairly significant because just around now, as the weather becomes colder and energy becomes more scarce, is right when Russia usually begins targeting critical heating and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. So this sort of aerial support in terms of further air support, air-to-air missiles, and air defense is crucial, specifically at this period. It also further, amidst uncertain signals from Washington, it further reveals a strategic pattern from Zelenskyy. After facing this sort of resistance, as we saw with the Tomahawk missiles with the White House at the previous meeting in Washington, Zelenskyy has sort of doubled down on these European partnerships to give and partner with Ukraine for what is sorely needed on the battlefront and in the skies in Ukraine. It is also worth noting that Macron has been this sort of leading player in these talks over a coalition of the willing and the main proponent of deploying peacekeeping forces in Ukraine at a ceasefire scenario. So overall, a very positive signal from Europe and for Ukraine.
Yeah, we didn't mention the Rafale fighting jets, which is much further down the line. But how will Ukraine fund the purchase of these 100 Rafales and the previously agreed 100 Gurpins from Sweden? I mean, these are billions of dollars of fighter jets.
This is primarily done with partnerships with allied member states and through a recent scheme that was proposed by the Commission, for example, where around 140 billion euros of available cash generated by frozen Russian assets could be put into use on the ground in Ukraine, both in its recovery and for possible military use. However, this plan has recently stalled due to Belgian objections, due to concerns over mutualization of the risk in the case this money cannot be recovered from Russia, or Russia would aim to recover these assets.
Right, we'll get to that in just a minute, but do you think that Zelenskyy received the support that he needed from Macron and that France will stay the course on Ukraine, especially in light of the Energoatom corruption scandal?
It's certainly a positive sign from France, especially right now as there are multiple pressing geopolitical risks, not only for Europe, but for the United States, and as President Macron's political situation back home becomes more tenuous. It is definitely a good sign that this sort of partnership is continuing, that there is continued Western and European support for not only military but budgetary support for Ukraine, that there's this momentum to continue moving on that front. However, as always, more is needed for Ukraine, more supplies and and faster delivery to prevent these ongoing Russian strikes on energy and military infrastructure in Ukraine.
Right. It certainly seems like Europe doesn't have a choice here. They still have to support Ukraine and, of course, allow it to be as victorious as possible on the battlefield. Let's go over to NATO headquarters and with the Belgian Prime Minister. Finnish President Aleksander Stubb tried to find a solution to fund Ukraine for the years 2026, 2027. Let's listen.
When it comes to funding Ukraine, it seems rather clear that there are three options. The first one is that EU member states, or NATO member states for that matter, pay directly, either by taking more loans or using current reserves. The second option is the mutualization of debt on a European level, as was done with Next Generation Europe and with SAFE. And the third option, of course, is the use of the immobilized assets.
All right, let's go through these three scenarios real quick. If member states fund directly, there's a worry that not all will contribute and the burden sharing will be uneven.
Yes, that is absolutely a concern, which is why European solidarity is needed now more than ever to push this sort of deal through and to find these necessary funds for Ukraine. Just recent forecasts have predicted that the Ukrainian state budget deficit is projected to be around $41.5 billion going into 2026. And Politico has even reported recently that Ukraine will face a financing crisis in 2026 unless this sort of funding goes through from the European Union from the immobilized Russian assets, which is why quick decision making and a decisive decision on these immobilized Russian assets and further funding for Ukraine is so crucial heading into November and then December.
So you think that's probably the most likely path is actually working with Belgium to somehow back those funds from being dispersed so that Belgium isn't by itself. What about sharing the debt on the European level? I mean, is that likely to be blocked by Hungary, Slovakia, and maybe even the Czech Republic? How can this challenge be overcome?
That is certainly the more medium to long-term financing solution for the European Union. As you mentioned, there is a fair amount of reticence from Hungary and now Slovakia. And that is, I think, a longer-term hurdle for Ukraine and Ukraine's allies in the European Union to overcome. There isn't currently an easy answer to this question about how to best overcome, which is why a lot of the focus and hope currently is on this financing for immobilized Russian assets, since it is not necessarily additional money that needs to be raised on the European Union level. However, on the financing, there is a sense of optimism since the leaders agreed to delay at least a final decision until December. And Ukraine's allies in the European Union, such as Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, insisted that December must be the final deadline for a decision on this funding, which at least reflects that this is an issue that the European Union member states and leaders are currently looking at, and there is momentum to keep this going. And the concerns on the Belgian side are understandable. Belgium and Brussels do not want to be left out in the cold in case, for example, they are required to pay this significant amount of money within a short amount of time. So the best negotiations and compromise on this issue to alleviate those concerns is duly needed on the European Union level.
Yeah, and how do you think those negotiations are going to go? How can the European Union back up the loan to satisfy Belgium so that it won't be left on the hook if Russia comes along wanting its money after the war?
There is one thing that Belgium is at least currently pushing for is legally binding guarantees that EU member states would contribute to this fund if it needed to be repaid through other measures. And I think that's the primary concern from the Belgian side, is that This needs to be covered and agreed upon all 27 member states of the European Union. And currently, it is the best solution to fund Ukraine's growing deficit and to continue supporting Ukraine in the short and medium term.
And finally, if we look at the front lines in Ukraine, in the east, of course, we've seen a lot of Russian movement forwards into Ukrainian territory. It's not a blitzkrieg or anything like that, but we do see quite a critical situation along that very long front line. Is time on Ukraine's side right now, or do efforts need to be doubled to try and break this impasse and get to a ceasefire? How do you see this whole situation developing through until the end of the year?
This part of the year is specifically always very difficult for Ukraine, considering the temperatures drop. It becomes more difficult to logistically supply the front lines, but it similarly becomes a more difficult situation for Russian forces as well, since tanks have more difficulty traversing these colder climates, these colder parts of the year. However, more support for Ukraine right now in this crucial period is needed, both in terms of the budgetary support and also military equipment on the front lines. A lot of experts say that time is on Russia's side in this case scenario, but realistically, the Russian front isn't looking particularly good for Moscow and for Russia either, with the multiple strikes on Russian oil and gas refineries, with a looming budget crisis on the Russian end as well, and the growing discontent from both of these developments, whether that is paying additional money at the pump for many Russian citizens, which is felt very crucially in the border states, but also with an overlying sense on the Russian side that just general public discontent as well.
Right. Well, it's certainly going to take a little bit of time for those Ukrainian imposed sanctions on Russian oil to bite. Aleksander Cwalina, contractor at the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you all for watching, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.